So now I'm putting on my Bay Area Council hat. Last presentation was more my Santa Rosa YIMBY hat. Let's talk about the Bay Area Council. So, all right, so we just did the homeless point in time count, the 2025 count. That was last Friday. Did anybody do that? Yeah, which precinct did you get?
We were in Napa County.
In Napa, okay. All right. Anyone do it in Santa Rosa here? No? Okay. I live in Railroad Square, just on the other side of the freeway, so I was able to do mine. Counted 38 people, cold, rainy night. That was the 2025 count, but the 2024 data officially became available not much earlier, about a month ago. And so here are the highlights. California now has got the 5th highest rate of homelessness in the United States. That's actually down from 2nd or 3rd the past few years, but our rate kept going higher, just not as high as some of the other states. And when you rank each state by their per capita homeless populations, is this per capita? Yeah, this is the per capita. A couple of things immediately stand out to me. One is that all of the places with the highest concentration, just a complete class on their own, are the high-cost blue states. Hawaii, New York, Oregon, California, Washington, all the high-cost blue states. And then when you look at unsheltered homelessness, which is the red or the orange bars, it's mostly in just a handful of states. 60% of all unsheltered homeless Americans live in these 5 states. 60%. Hawaii, Oregon, California, Washington, Nevada. And what didn't show up on this slide, oh, there we go, it just phases in. West Virginia, some people say, substance use disorder, addiction, that's what's causing homelessness. Highest rate of overdose deaths in the United States is West Virginia. Highest rate of poverty is Mississippi. So when you talk about what's driving homelessness, you have to take into account some of these statistics that don't conform with what you might expect. So let's take a look at rates of homelessness in cities and regions across the United States. Previous slide was by state. This is by region. New York, LA, the Bay Area, they account for about 33% of all homelessness in the United States, just in those 3 regions. I'm a broken record on this, but it always shocks me that New York can have so many homeless people and so few unsheltered. They provide shelter to almost everybody. So again, back to what's causing this, mental health an issue. For in individual instances, of course, mental health is an issue. But at scale, what do you see when you look back at the rates of, you compare rates of mental illness versus the rate of homelessness across the United States, you actually see a slight regression. As homelessness goes up, or as rates of homelessness go up, the rate of homelessness goes down. As the rate of homelessness goes up, your rate of preponderance of mental illness actually goes down. Not by much, probably insignificant statistical noise here, but it's not a clear correlation, like, oh, clearly that's what's going on. That's not what's happening with mental illness. And when you look at with poverty, the reverse is happening. As the rates of poverty go up, the rate of homelessness goes down. So something's happening here. What's going on with the rate of homelessness and poverty? Now, well, in impoverished areas typically have declining populations. West Virginia and Mississippi, right? These are places where they're poor, and as a result of that poverty, they've kind of backed themselves into housing abundance. So they've got abundant housing relative to demand, making housing cheap, making it, even if you do have an addiction, even if your life is messed up, you probably at the end of the day can still afford housing someplace. Obviously, we don't want to be in that situation. We want to be building housing so that it remains sufficient to meeting our demands, our growing demands. We want to be more like Texas. Got a growing growing population, growing jobs, growing population, one of the lowest rates of homelessness in the United States. So they've got the same jobs pressures that we've had in California the last 10 years, but without the huge boom in homelessness. And so then, okay, so if it's not mental illness, and it's certainly not poverty, what about the cost of housing? Here it is. This is it. These graphs on the left show counties, on the right show cities. As the rates of homelessness go up, or as the rate of median rent goes up, the rate of homelessness goes up in both cities and counties. And this works at the state level too. So the California Legislative Analyst Office, the Turner Center, the Bay Area Council Economic Institute have looked at these numbers every way to Sunday, and the biggest influencer on housing costs, which is driving this, is the supply relative to demand. So we've got to do something about the supply of housing. And so one of the other reasons why we think that is because of charts like this, which show on the left how metros with the most housing construction over the past year have seen the largest declines in rent. So 1 year supply change this way, you're looking at 5% increases in their rental supply have resulted in nearly 5%, in some cases over 5% decreases in their rent. On the flip side, cities that have seen tiny supply changes in their housing stock have seen big rent increases. But my favorite one is from Austin. Austin's in the middle of a tech boom, an investment boom, and a jobs boom. And they've also been on a huge apartment building boom. And in the last 2 years, they've seen rents plummet 15% during an economic boom. Imagine if in 2018, when people were throwing rocks at the Google buses in San Francisco, rents plummeted 15%. It would be something to rejoice over. And we didn't have that, of course. We didn't build anything. And then our rents kept going up and our rates of homelessness kept going up. So some people might say when I do this presentation, they go, hold on. There's a crane across the street. There's a crane over there on Railroad Square. They're just wrapping up the cannery built apartment. They're building this. We're building housing. That's when I bring up this chart. This chart shows the amount of new housing built, single family units in blue, multifamily in yellow, in California, every year going back to 1954. Every business, every industry has got cycles. Boom cycles, bust cycles, there's a business cycle to everything. Business is no exception. The amount of units we're building at the peak of our cycle over the past 20 years is what we were building at the bottom of our cycle 40 years ago. And this isn't adjusted for population, this is real units. So we've got twice as many people here. And we're building fewer units at the peak of our cycle than a population state with half our size today was building 40 years ago. This is going to result in a chronic housing shortage, which is what we have. So this takes us looking back a little closer at the Bay Area. This shows all of the very low income housing units that our RENA process said we should have built since 2020. We should have built almost 150,000 units. We ended up building about 40,000 units, a gap of about 97,000. I know that math didn't exactly work, but 97,000 units is what we're missing. Had we built those 97,000 units, would that have affected the 38,000 homeless Bay Area residents? Yeah, it would have. It would have done a lot to avoid that. So we must allow housing. So my first kind of thesis here is that we have to allow housing, more housing, at all levels of income to reduce cost pressures throughout the housing ecosystem that are the biggest force that push people out into homelessness. It's not going to solve homelessness, but we're at a place now where 40 Californians out of 10,000 are becoming homeless. That level of failure can't be mitigated by homeless programs, by public programs. It can't. We've tried. Over the last 5 years, we've invested $20 billion. We've run this huge experiment, $20 billion of the state funds, to try to mitigate that failure. And we've failed. The homeless population has increased every year because the cost of building a unit of permanent supportive housing costs on average $650,000 across the state. But in places like the Bay Area and LA, it's closer to $1 million. To scale that, permanent supportive housing statewide would cost somewhere between $80 and $100 billion. Do the advocates for permanent supportive housing everywhere have a plan to raise that? They do not. So what's the plan? Well, their plan is, they don't say it this way, but the actual plan is, let people sleep outside and we'll get to them when we get to them. That's a recipe for disaster. So let me talk about shelters now, because that's what we've been doing the last 20 years. We've been focusing a lot of our might on permanent supportive housing. All right, we've got this big policy failure. We're not building a lot of housing. We're going to have 40 homeless people for every 10,000. Unlike Mississippi, which has got 5 for every 10,000. We've got 40, so now we've got to deal with that 40. How are we going to do it? We're going to focus on permanent supportive housing. That costs $1 million a door. We're not going to focus on building shelter, because a sheltered homeless person is still homeless. We want to end homelessness, so we're not going to build shelter. So where are we at with shelter? Right now, California builds less than 4 shelter beds per 10 homeless residents. That's second lowest in the United States. I got Santa Rosa located on here. We've got 4.5 homeless beds, shelter beds, for every 10 homeless residents that we got in the city. The national average, somewhere about here, it's about 80. Where is it? I think I had US on here. It's right around here. About 8.5 beds for every 10 homeless residents. So someone mentioned earlier, New York doesn't have a lot of unsheltered homelessness because it's so cold. They don't have a whole lot of unsheltered homelessness because they have beds. They've got 1 bed for every for every homeless resident. If you're homeless in New York, there's a place for you to go. And 95% choose to take it, particularly in the wintertime. But they've got the option. Here, we're just speculating. Would they take it? I don't know. We don't have it. We've never run the experiment. So instead, yeah.
It looks like the colder states you're forced to because of the sheer people dying on the street.
Yes. Well, I would flip it. I would say the warmer states have created excuses not to do it.
Yeah, New York has a right to shelter. I mean, they legally have to provide a shelter bed for everybody who's homeless. They
yeah.
don't have in California, we don't have right to shelter.
Right. Yes, that was a court decision in the early 80s that resulted in New York City having to provide that 1-to-1. That's how they got to it. In Massachusetts, they've got a right to shelter that was passed by the state legislature. DC has a right to shelter that they passed through city ordinance. Point is that it's a public choice. It's a policy choice. They made a choice where we're going to have a shelter for everyone who needs it. California, we've decided not to give people that choice. Yeah.
My head's just spinning, trying to think of all of the things, I guess. But so I had a couple of questions. My first one was, okay, so as we reduce the barriers and making the process to provide services like this available, or not services like this, rather build more housing of all income levels to reduce the pressure. What is the most significant barrier? Is it funding?
To building housing?
Yeah, it just boils down to a funding issue?
Well, there's a couple different things. Housing in general, market rate housing, it's local ordinance. It's barriers on zoning restrictions, on parking requirements, on discretionary reviews, on having to pay off different nonprofit groups in order to get approval. So that's the overarching, that 99% of all housing is market rate housing. So that's the biggest piece. Now, when you're talking about permanent supportive housing or housing for extremely low income residents, yeah, the market's not going to solve that. So you're going to need some public subsidy. What I'm saying is that if you've got 40 people for every 10,000 residents, the market can't subsidize all that. So we need more market rate units to bring that 40 per 10,000 down to like 10 to 15 per 10,000. Then we can handle that.
So in a municipality, would it be to just allow for greater density? Like, what would be, if you could pinpoint a couple of provisions that would...
Can I jump in here and
Yeah.
say, we're gonna do, like, our next thing is gonna be around specific solutions to developers, to policymakers, like
Yeah.
on financial solutions, on policy stuff, just like this. It will be
Okay.
virtual.
Okay.
You will be invited, because he's got 5 more minutes on
Okay,
this
sorry.
specific issue. And then we got the next thing, and we got the next thing. But and look at our housing action plan online, and a lot of those things is right there. But
Yeah.
we're gonna, like, our whole thing will be kind of a virtual version of what we did on our summit around those kind of policy solutions. So
Gen H has got great tools on what you could actually do to activate those market rate units. Let me wrap up then on unsheltered homelessness. Let me finish this piece on unsheltered homelessness, because I think this is so important. As I've said, our current plan, our current policy in California is we're going to focus on permanent supportive housing. Everyone knows it doesn't scale fast enough because it's too expensive to build. And meanwhile, while we do that, we're going to continue to lose ground. Every one person we resolve their homelessness with a permanent supportive housing unit, 3 more people become homeless, and they sit on the streets and they wait and they wait and they wait until we get around to them. And while they're waiting, for the past 20 years, the kind of standard wisdom has been, well, California has got inclement weather. They'll be fine. It's not like New York, right? We don't have to shelter them. We can kind of forget about them for a little bit. They'll be all right. The data in the last 5 years on this has really been devastating to showcase how horrible it is to go without one of life's basic needs, shelter. The all homeless mortality is up 233% in California the past 10 years. Overdose deaths make up about up almost 500%. If you're on the streets, you're 26 times more likely to die from drugs and alcohol, 11 times more likely to be killed by a car accident. Think about it. You're on the sidewalks, you're in parking lots, of course. 10 times more likely to be murdered, 5 times more likely to die from suicide. Average age of death is 51. This is a catastrophic public health and safety crisis. And we just kind of allow it because we've said, yes, unsheltered homelessness is bad, or unsheltered homelessness is bad, but not getting people into permanent supportive housing at a snail's pace is worse. This is a unfortunate but a tolerable cost of doing business of our status quo. That's got to change. So finally, I think this is my last one. Chronic homelessness is a shelter problem. So homelessness overall is a housing problem most of the time. The biggest chunk of it is a housing problem. But chronic homelessness, the people who are shouting at colors and shapes on the streets, the people who are really having a difficult time, a big part of that is downstream of our decision to not provide shelter. Mayor Steinberg in Sacramento, he's got a saying he always says during his speech, if you didn't have a substance use disorder or a mental illness when you first entered the encampment, you will soon, because of the trauma that life like that endures and exposes people to. There's a woman interviewed in the Sacramento Bee last year who described how she took up methamphetamines to stay up all night so she wouldn't be assaulted in her tent anymore. That's the level of trauma that's going on out there. And then, not a month later, 2 people in her same encampment were killed by a falling tree in a storm. We can't keep allowing this. And when you do that, this is what happens. The rate of chronic homelessness goes up. So these people have got severe mental health issues. They've got severe psychiatric, severe addiction problems. And resolving their homelessness costs 10 times what it costs to solve someone. It probably costs about 10 times to resolve their homelessness now than what it would have had we intervened right when they hit the streets and we brought them into a shelter. Got them stabilized, got them a bed, got them a safe place, and then they could have stayed there for a few years and then be referred to housing. So we're in a vicious cycle on this as well, because now this costs so much money to solve. Again, we don't have money for anything else. So it all starts with building housing abundance to bring down the cost. So a couple points here. Reduce the rate of homelessness with abundant housing relative to demand. Prioritize bringing people indoors, saving lives, and restoring access to public spaces, something that the voters desperately want. Jurisdictions should be trying to keep their shelter inventory at least 60% of the homeless population by your most recent point in time count. Most in the Bay Area, their shelter inventory is about 40, 45%. You gotta get it up. We gotta get more options to get people indoors. You should do it with non-congregate shelter. So this is interim housing. There was a bill passed last year, SB 1395 by Senator Becker. It was a Bay Area Council-sponsored bill. It eliminates local barriers to quickly building interim housing units, which is basically about the same cost as a homeless shelter, but someone gets their own lock and key, their own door. And when they have that, they voluntarily take it at a much higher rate than the old navigation centers. And then if you've got that, you can pair that up with camping enforcements to bring people indoors, to give people back their public space, and also to bring the folks in who are having psychiatric issues and protecting them from the predators who actually are out there on the streets. So with that, thank you, and happy to answer any questions. I'll start here, Chris.
You said build housing at all income levels.
Yes.
And, in our community, we put forward a housing solution, and it was rejected in part because people were concerned about the amount of high-income housing that would result.
Yeah.
And how strong is the argument that doesn't matter? It's still important to build that kind of housing if that's the only option you have in this particular economic, time frame.
Yeah.
With regards to, you know, the human rights issues that you've outlined here with homelessness, but also low-income people, even missing middle people,
Yeah.
right?
So on that point, I think all of the data where we have data on what the effects of market rate housing are on nearby rents shows a regression effect. When you build market rate housing, the areas around it, rents go down. You're relieving pressure. Because the people who want to live there, if you don't build it, what you're doing is you're baking in a cost bidding war between people who've got the resources to buy a new unit and those who don't have the resources to do that and are in the old legacy housing stock. So if you don't build them the apartment, that's fine. In some folks' imagination, the high income earners are going to leave or something. No, they're going to outbid everybody else for the stock that's left. That's what happened in San Francisco. That's why San Francisco's population used to be 15% African American, now it's 4%. We didn't build housing. We didn't build affordable housing, and it's become a much less diverse place because of it, both economically and socially. So yeah, and there's a lot of data on that.